Welcome to Lessons in Leadership. I'm Bill Ferguson, and I'm here with my partner, Peter Linneman. And we're going to talk a little bit about ourselves to start, do a brief introduction, and then we're going to really focus on the rationale behind the series. So with that, Peter, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Peter Linneman. I'm an emeritus professor at the Wharton School of Business, where I served for about 34 years. I headed the real estate program there for many years, taught there all types of topics, had an amazing set of students, many who have gone on to be leaders in their own right in the industry. I also have a vehicle since 1979, Linneman Associates, which is an advisory and boutique investment firm through its related entities. Published a lot over the years, including Linneman Letter, which is widely read in the industry. My book, most recent edition with Bruce Kirsch, Real Estate Finance and Investments, Risk and Opportunities. We have also a vehicle, Refia, which is sort of an online training program in real estate. I've been blessed to know a lot of the leaders in the industry for almost 40 years. And so, Bill, why don't you tell us who you are?
Thank you, Peter. And first of all, I feel very fortunate to have you as my colleague and partner in this series. Peter is, I think, one of the foremost strategists in our industry, and I hope to add a little bit of value relative to the topic of leadership. Anyway, I'm Bill Ferguson, Chairman and CEO of Ferguson Partners. We founded the firm 32 years ago, as of March of 2021. We are a firm that is best described as a global talent management boutique. We serve the real assets, hospitality, and healthcare services industries. We do about 350 board and senior level searches a year around the world, and we also do an equal amount of consulting assignments. So I feel very blessed to have survived a number of crises running from the GFC to obviously the pandemic. And just publishing my fifth and probably last book, in essence, about the leadership skills that are really required to persevere through the pandemic. So Peter, do you want to talk to the audience a little bit about the rationale behind the series? That would be great.
Sure. It was originally your idea. You gave me a call and said, look, there's a lot of stuff about deals. There's a lot of stuff about economy out there. There's a lot of that kind of stuff. But there seems to be a gap about really exploring in an ongoing way lessons in leadership, lessons in strategy in our area of real estate. And we talked about it, and I thought it was a great idea. So we have crafted this series of programs we're going to have with regularity speakers. We've got a number of speakers, just to name a few: Sam Zell, John Gray from Blackstone, and many others who will be coming as we go through the year. And what we'll do is we'll sit down, we'll talk to them, and the focus is not going to be on what the deal is right now or where do they see the opportunity right now, but how have they led their firms both strategically and leadership-wise. And Bill, you've had lots with your own firm and the firms you've worked with on leadership, leadership search, leadership screening. I've got a little that way, a lot of background in governance and strategy. And so we thought that this would be a good pairing, and we think this will be an exciting series. Bill, we thought, I actually should go one step further, we thought that an interesting way to start it out would be to have each of us talk to each other about leadership and strategy and lessons we've observed and so forth. So Bill, why don't I start with you? You've been involved both in your own firm, in your own career, but also with lots of searches for lots of different situations. Tell me kind of a simple, what did you learn about leadership in that regard?
Well, Peter, I think you learn a lot over 40 years, and just to provide some frame of reference, our industry, including the single family business, is the largest industry in the world. And people don't really appreciate that, but the reality is it is. And it's been a great incubator relative to watching leadership evolve. I mean, if you really think about it, over the last 40 years, the industry has transformed from entrepreneurial to institutional, from private to public, and from regional to global. And I think the great leaders in our industry, in essence, have created a lot of the success that these firms ultimately have achieved. And I guess if I've learned one thing, is that strategy and leadership are basically inextricably connected. And great leaders do create great companies. And it is all about a balance of great strategic vision, but it's also equally importantly about one's cultural framework, what I like to call their EQ. And I think that's often very, very underestimated as it relates to, in essence, kind of, everything from assessing to interviewing to ultimately deciding upon a leader who steps up and gets the chance to run a company in its next evolution.
I think your comment, Bill, about strategy and leadership being really critically combined, as you were saying that, it occurred to me, I've been reading some stuff about World War One, and you could have all the troops you want believing in you as a leader, and you're doing all the right things with that EQ. But if the strategy was go over the top into the mouth of incessant gunfire and machine guns and gas, you're not going to succeed, even though you may be inspirational. And I think that it's funny, I hadn't thought of quite the way it fits together until you said it. But they both occur. And I've been involved a lot working with leaders and forming strategy. And that's a good insight. That's a critical insight I think you have there, Bill. By the way, in that regard, I'm curious. I don't think I've ever had this conversation with you over the years, which is you've been involved with lots of searches. Your industry is involved in lots of searches. You and your brethren are very good at what they do. You introduce people who are well screened, well credentialed to terrific firms who go through their own screening and credentialing. And yet, what's the data? I don't know, 40% of outside searches, outside hires of leaders blow up within a year or two. And I don't know what the number is internal, but even there, probably 10, 20% blow up. Why? What's your, it couldn't have been lack of effort. Why?
Well, I think there are a couple of things, Peter, and it's a really, really good question. I would say, first of all, if you have an inexperienced search committee, what a lot of people tend to do is to fall in love with a personality. Okay, and the reality is that, first of all, that personality may not be substantive. There was a recent announcement over the last couple of weeks of an appointment of a CEO in a public company, and I know the candidate well, and in fact, we'd worked for them probably 5 years ago. The issue ultimately was it was a very, very difficult place to work, and the culture was not good, and unfortunately, the leadership was just not there. So in some cases, our industry does not do as good a job as it should in really getting at the core of the referencing, talking to people who know the candidate, have worked side by side with the candidate every day, have not brought in professional leadership consultants to do the assessment. It's very much, too much focused, in fact, on sitting across the table from somebody. You develop a relationship with them, you like them, but you really don't do the homework on what they're all about, what they're like on a good day, what they're like on a bad day. And the reality is you can't learn that from their lawyer, you can't learn that from their banker. You have to learn that from people whose judgment you trust, who have worked side by side with somebody over an extended period of time. So the first point is you really, really have to do your homework. And in this case, I don't think this company did their homework on the person's leadership skills.
It's interesting. As you said that, I just had, I know I'm interrupting you, but as you said that, you know what my nightmare was when I was at Wharton, and we're very active in placing students, by the way. Every year we have a lot of students, and as you know, I work, this is entry level, right? But I'd work with a lot of firms to help them sort through the students, a lot of students to sort through. The worst thing that could happen, the falling in love from, is every once in a while, once about every 10, 12 years, I would have a student who you couldn't help but falling in love with in a 30-minute interview. But by the 31st minute, they were a disaster, right? And you go, oh my God, you know, they got hired and they were mad. And I'd have to tell people that if they did their homework. And the other one that was funny that way, Bill, was that the person who appeared like they might be the best candidate for whatever reason,
Right.
out of all the students I had that year, was appealing on the surface, but after about 5 minutes, they blew up in an interview or in a screening. And the reason that was a disaster was they would say, well, if this is the best they got this year, they got nobody very good this year, right? And I'd have to say, no, 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 got to go deeper. You got to do that homework that you're talking about. So at every level.
Yeah, I'll give you another case in point. You know, we do a lot of work for private family businesses. And recruiting a CEO for a private family business, as you know all too well, because you were a director of the Crossland Company, which was family owned and actually founder led at the time that you were involved with that, is it requires a different kind of personality. So we were doing this search for a client of ours on the West Coast, and there were two finalist candidates. And the first one was right out of central casting. Looked good, you know, powerful personality, had all the right pedigrees and whatever. And the other one was more understated, probably a better listener, probably much more open to getting people's opinions and perspectives before making a decision. And sure enough, the client wanted to go with the first candidate, right? But the reality was and then the candidate started, you know, the focus became compensation. And then the focus became who's making the decisions. And I said to the client, you know, if you're looking for somebody who's going to fit into a family culture and really be respectful of the fact that the family ultimately is a decision maker, you've got to go after that second candidate because they have the skill set in this particular situation to be much more effective than the first candidate, who I would bet, you know, dollars to donuts in 12 months, 18 months is going to be out the door because they're going to be frustrated because they don't have the autonomy ultimately to make decisions.
Yeah. Well, I must say that phenomena of autonomy exists in a lot of other firms that aren't family, in the sense of, okay, you hired me as president, but am I really president? Or you hired me as CEO, but am I really CEO? Or is it still the chairman? Or however those dynamics work,
right,
which are challenging.
Right. Well, Peter, let's move back to the topic of strategy for a minute. As I mentioned, you know, our industry over the last 40 years has gone through a fundamental metamorphosis relative to size, scale, public, you know, all the things that we know all too well today. As you look at the industry going forward, what are the major strategic issues that you think we as an industry have to address?
Well, in the near term, you've got to deal with how do we get vaccinated? What does all that mean? And that's all pretty obvious and has been spoken about by me. If you haven't seen it, go to Linneman Associates. There's a bunch of webinars I've given on that. So I think you're asking more broadly, what do you deal with?
Right.
I think more broadly, you're dealing with the real estate markets get ever more efficient, for lack of a better phrase. What that means is that you have to be sure that your niche is protected. And the only reason I say that is, as you know, if you go back 35 years ago, the market was very inefficient. And you could do well simply because nobody else was challenging you in some ways. That's less true. Now, not totally untrue, but less true. So I think increased efficiency will continue to be. I think increased professionalization. And again, we're both old enough to remember what the industry was like 35, 40 years ago, where things like succession, things like strategy, nobody cared about, right? Mm-hmm. Then if you said truly strategic, I think each sector has its own challenges. For example, retail, will everything really be online? I don't think so. What won't be online? How do we fill in for what disappears? How does the aging of the baby boomer fit into repositioning retail? Because historically, the industry has ignored older consumers, but we now have a population of older consumers who are the wealthiest, highest income consumers in history, and they got time and money unlike ever before. How do you adjust to that? I think on multifamily, the question is, as you get more lifestyle renters, what do they really want? Because as you know, again, 35 years ago, this was largely an industry of necessity renters. Mm-hmm. Increasingly, it kind of evolved into lifestyle, or at least some lifestyle renters. And we're still guessing around what they want, right? We haven't really figured out what they want. You put in a little longer swimming pool, right? And say, okay, that's what they want. And I think that's still early stages of figuring out that. Office has got a big challenge facing it. I think people come back to the office. I jokingly said, you want proof they'll come back to the office for better, for worse, but not for lunch and certainly not every day. They're going to go back to the office. But how do you organize those workers? How do you get them in? Do the small floor usage, space usage per worker, how does that evolve out? How do you work your way through? Do leases need to get shorter? But if they get shorter, will tenants pay the premium associated with that greater risk? So I think each sector has. What I would say, Bill, is that unlike when I began in the business, most of the leaders, there were a handful who thought about these types of issues in their own sector. Not many, right? Most of them were, can I get the tax advantages? How much can I sell the tax advantages for, and how much can I borrow? And
right.
Can I get that was strategy. Strategy was, do I have a friendly banker who will write 110% loan? That is, I would get a loan of 110 for 100 in cost. Can I sell the tax credits? And if so, for how much? Because that was money found. And the third is, how soon can I do it again? That was strategy.
Yeah, what's interesting, Peter, too, I think to your point, is, for the first 9 months of the pandemic, everybody was focused on the care and feeding of their people. I mean, what I've heard, and I don't know what you've heard, is that, and then people started talking about culture and how much culture was being negatively impacted by the fact that everybody was remote. And I think that's become increasingly of concern, that in business execution, just executing the business as everybody gets busier again. And I don't know if you've seen that in the conversations you've had.
Absolutely, absolutely. Everybody puts on a brave face. Everybody puts on a brave face saying we're doing quite well, because what's the alternative, right? We're doing quite well. Having said that, come on, it would be interesting when we get to people like Chris Nacetta, who's on our list, or Sam Zell, or John Gray, or others, which is, okay, you've been able to manage the firm through this. Could you have built the firm remotely? And my guess is no. How would you integrate all these people? How would you execute? I'm not trying to say I know that's what they're going to say. I think we're going to hear that a bit as we talk about the near-term challenges of leadership with those people and the longer term. But
let me touch on a couple other points in strategy, and then maybe we can go into some lessons learned from your board experiences. But did you foresee? I mean, this is different than the GFC in the sense that you have sectors in our industry that are on fire.
Right.
The single family business, logistics, infrastructure, manufactured housing, self storage. And on the other hand, you've got industries on their back from a cash flow perspective.
Right.
Seniors housing, as you said, retail, hospitality, even the office business, maybe outside of life science.
Right.
Did you or did many people really appreciate this was going to be fundamentally different than the GFC?
I think most people thought it was just going to be another cyclical recession.
Right.
That is one, and I think a lot of them are still thinking of it as a cyclical recession, that we're going to come out of it. And this whole stimulus kind of is we're coming out of it with traditional stuff, as opposed to, no, this is not a cyclical recession at all. You have to craft very different policies. I did a web broadcast, I think it was on March 24th last year. It was my birthday. And we posted it. And
March 24th is your birthday?
Yeah.
March 22nd is my birthday.
March is a good time.
All if it comes to springtime, buddy, that's a good thing.
So, but I remember that, and I got about 80% of the stuff right. Namely, it's not a typical recession. You're going to have to deal with it very different way. But I will say, I got completely wrong single family housing. I thought it would collapse, and I made the comment, without a job, without confidence, and no down payment, how can single family housing hold up? And what I missed was about 80% of the economy still had jobs, just roughly, right?
Right.
And after a couple of months, they realized that their sectors were going to be okay. We didn't know that in March, but their sectors were going to be okay, and we all weren't going to be dead. And the third is they had their lifestyle changed, and they had all this savings flooding in. So here I was thinking they're not going to have a down payment, and the fact that they had all this savings flooding in because their vacation was canceled and so they suddenly looked around and said, I'd never adjusted my lifestyle to get that money, but the world adjusted my lifestyle. I have enough for a down payment. I didn't see that coming at all. And that's what radically changed that sector. So it's a good example where once I understood what was going on, or at least I think I understood what was going on, I can kind of figure out the strategy. But it's a good example of I probably mapped over. Savings usually plummet during a downturn.
Right.
And this time for a lot of people, they skyrocketed during the downturn. And so I missed that. And it's a good example of a good, even if you're thorough, if you will, in your strategic thinking, you got to admit you're going to fail a lot. Even if you're quite good at it, you're going to fail a lot. And then I think one of the lessons about strategy is the best made strategy can be wrong for whatever reasons. You better adjust. So my thinking adjusted pretty quickly to what was going on.
Right. One final question on strategy, Peter, and then let's turn to governance. People talk about, strategists being great visionaries and innovators, right? Innovators in particular. Given the globalization of our business, how doable is innovation, do you think, as it relates to continuing to build and grow these companies?
I think innovation is mostly at the margin. Everybody likes to think of the big breakthroughs, but if you read the history of big breakthroughs, they tend to be very incremental. You read the history of computers and the big breakthrough, and then you go back and you read they were already noodling about it in the 1860s, and machine learning and so forth. So most, in my experience of an observation, most innovation is incremental, but that doesn't mean it doesn't achieve a lot, right? It achieves a lot. And one of the best property people I ever knew, I was walking around one of their truly innovative buildings, and he said to me, people think it's genius that there are these eureka moments, And
Hmm.
it's just a lot of paper that we throw in the wastebasket before we improved it. And anybody can make something different, just turn a building upside down. That's different, but it's not productive. So
Right.
most of it is the product of hard work, and learning what others did. I think I'd end my little on that, Bill, by saying if you don't know what others have done and how they've failed and how they've succeeded, it's hard to be creative. It's hard to be innovative because,
Learning from history, right?
yeah, huge,
Yeah,
huge.
absolutely. Well, Peter, let's segue into governance. Obviously, governance is in the limelight for all host of reasons, ESG, DEI, and whatever. And as you said earlier in your introduction, you've served on 20 plus public or private boards. So you are kind of the epitome of this governance evolution anyway. Um, and one of the things I think you've done brilliantly is you've served on a number of special committees and chaired these special committees. And it's a very slippery slope because on the one hand, you've got different competing interests, often internally,
Yeah.
and yet you've got shareholders to be responsible to. Just give us an example, not necessarily naming
Yeah,
names,
no,
but
and I've done it.
navigated through.
It's a great question about governance. And I think it's changed dramatically over my career. I mean, I think it used to be an insider. This was just before my time, but I got the impression an insider would come in and say, oh, I'm going to buy the company, or I'm going to spin out this to myself, or something, and the board would kind of go, okay, that's what you want to do. Well, that has not been the experience. I think I went on my first board in 1987. And in my experience, I've not run into that. In fact, what I've run into quite the opposite. You set up real independent people. You make sure they have real independent advisors, legal, financial, whatever they need. You spend a lot of time. You get 3, 4, 5 directors who step up and do that extra work, and it's hard work. And it is difficult because on the one hand, think of it if the CEO is going to try to buy the company, just for an example. Well, one of the things you're wrestling with is we need to sell this company fully and fairly. And if it's not the CEO, we may have to live with the CEO for a while.
Right.
We have to live with that CEO and management team if we say we're not selling to you, but we're selling more broadly. And they have to help in that process. So it is a challenging exercise. And what I would really say, Bill, that I learned most, and it's about what makes a good director. It was in the context, really driven home by Rockefeller Center when I was chairman there. And it wasn't because there was an insider issue, but some people step up in the face of a challenge and do the extra. And some people step back, and everybody's equally credentialed. Everybody is equally smart. And in tough times, and especially like you're talking about in a special situation where there are conflicts floating around, you need people who will step up, not just stand still or step back.
Right.
And I don't know if I ever said to you, but echoes, Pete Peterson was a friend, and we were on a board together. And for those that don't know, legendary guy, one of the co-founders with Steve Schwarzman of Blackstone, but many other achievements. And I was once saying to Pete that I was shocked how a lot of my faculty friends at Wharton and others, when I had to end up spending like 2,000 hours as chairman of Rockefeller Center, non-executive, in a year, 2,000 hours. No chairman, non-executive is expecting to spend 2,000 hours. But
Are you getting paid by the hour or what?
Yes, but like a penny an hour, But the point is, I said, Pete, I was really surprised. Pete was a generation older than us. And I said, Pete, I'm really surprised. And that faculty just kept saying, why don't you just resign? It's too much work. And I said, well, that's crazy. And Pete made a really brilliant comment, what I thought is brilliant, which was, and that's why you get asked and put in these positions and they don't. And that's what you want from a governance point of view. Yes, you want credentialed. Yes, you want smart. Yes, you want diverse. All those are jacks are better to open. What you want is when times are tough, conflict or otherwise, people who will step up, not stand steady or step back. Now, not everybody can step up and take the leader position, but they're willing to be there.
Right.
I don't know what you've seen in that regard. I mean, but as you search directors these days, what are you seeing people want?
Well, I think a couple things, Peter. First of all, clients are looking much more holistically at the composition of the board, and they're looking at complementary backgrounds and skill sets. So, today, unlike 10 years ago, I'd say a lot of our clients are looking for maybe 2 to 3 independent directors who basically have a day job, because, those are the people who are dealing with disintermediation, the pace of change, big data, the pandemic. And the CEO wants a couple of people on the board who are kind of worried about what they're worried about. Secondly, diversity is a big push. The Black Lives Matter movement has clearly focused boards on now not just having one, but probably two diverse candidates on the board. And the theory resonates, right? You want people in the boardroom who are going to have a different set of perspectives, are going to ask questions, and are really going to push the envelope relative to deciding what's best. So, as McKinsey says all too often, diversity leads to better business results, and it does for sure. So, those are just some of the things I think we're seeing in the composition world. Peter, let me ask you one last question, and then maybe we wrap it up.
Okay.
We have seen a tremendous amount of activism in the real estate industry over the last 10 years, and big-time activists, people like Starboard and others who have entered the fray and gotten involved with Forest City and so forth. You've been on some boards where an activist has shown some interest in the stock. What's your view of activists, their role in the industry? Are they ultimately doing good for shareholders? What's your perspective on that?
So, and by the way, you're right. I've been on a couple of boards where they've appeared, and I've also, Bill, been on the side of an activist in a couple of instances over history. And if I were to, this won't shock you when I don't think it'll shock you. The impact of an activist is only as good as that party. Is only as good as that party. If that party is thoughtful and truly looking for value and has really identified a strategic that has been missed or conflicts that have been overlooked, particularly situations where there have been conflicts that have been tolerated or overlooked, they can do a lot of good. And, I'll go back years and years ago. I was very minor helpful when Roy Disney and Stan Gold worked to remove Michael Eisner. And remember, they had brought Michael Eisner in 20 years ago, 20 years earlier.
Right.
And their point wasn't Michael Eisner. Their point was he was fabulous, and then he became imperial and he stopped listening in his time. And I never dealt with Michael, but their activism reinvigorated that company, right? Their activism originally replacing before that replacing Walt Disney's, I had nothing to do with that, replacing his son-in-law, bringing in Eisner and Wells, reinvigorated Disney. It would have been long gone. Then the activist vis-a-vis Eisner to remove and reinvigorated the company again under Igor. So on the other hand, I've seen situations where you go, they have no idea what they're doing. They're strictly opportunist in a bad sense of the word, not opportunist in the good sense, right? They are scavengers, and it's about the vision. It's about the it's not surprising. It's about the people and their effort, it's not about their label. It's not about if they're labeled activists. It's, are they doing real things?
Yeah. Yeah, and I would agree with you, Peter. I think there are some activists that have done well by shareholders, and I think there are others who have been opportunistic. You know, we always represent our clients under siege. We don't represent the activists in particular, but I think net, some have made a real positive impact, and some have not. But anyway, well, Peter, I am really excited.
Well, this is a great kickoff. Why don't you tell them where we go from here a little bit, Bill, and that'll be our goodbye for this segment.
Right. Well, first of all, we're excited to have our first guest, Sam Zell, is going to be joining us, and then we're going to have subsequent sessions with John Gray. At Blackstone, we're going to spend some time also with Roy March, with Chris Nacetta, who's done a great job of turning around Hilton, Tom Baltimore, who's done a great job at Park Hotels. So we have a wonderful series of interviews coming up with truly great leaders. Everybody can watch these series either on the Ferguson Partners website. I'm sure, Peter, you'll have it up on your website. And we're very, very excited to bring this to the industry. And Peter, I feel blessed to have you as a partner. I think we'll do some great things and highlight the achievements of some great leaders in an industry where leadership doesn't always get the credit it should. So with that, thank you, my friend. Great to be here.
Get your shot. This will date it. You're getting your shot, I think, as soon as we're finished. I get mine in a couple of days. So hopefully within whatever, we can do this in person.
Absolutely. All right, my friend. God bless you, and thanks. It's been terrific. Take care.